All right. Well, good morning and afternoon, again, depending on time zone, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us for today's State Attainment Collaborative webinar on stakeholder engagement. I'm Patrick Crane. I'm the State Policy Director at the Lumina Foundation. And this is our fourth of five webinars as part of the State Attainment Collaborative. And instead of hearing from folks from Lumina or HCM, we will spend the bulk of our time hearing from your colleagues in the great states of Texas and Maryland today. And they're going to be sharing information about meaningful stakeholder engagement, both in the goal setting process and in the work that takes place once the goal is actually set. And so, as you know, setting the goal is an important step in the process, but it's really the work that follows afterwards that's so critically important. And so today we're hoping really to make sure that there's a lot of opportunity for all of you to learn from Texas and Maryland as well as from each other in this conversation. And so you will hear a little bit more from me about value-centered attainment goals. And then we will have a brief engagement exercise. I'll turn it to Madeline in a little bit to walk through that. And then the bulk of our time will be spent in facilitated discussion around stakeholder engagement in Maryland and Texas. And, we'll spend our time there. We'll have some, reflections at the end, and then we will close it out. So with that, I think we can dive in. And for those of you who have joined our previous calls, this slide will look familiar to you, but wanted to ground our conversation around stakeholder engagement with what we're trying to accomplish and how we're approaching this work. And, we know that states have adopted many different attainment goals over the years, but the common characteristics of strong goals you can see on this slide. First, quantifiable and measurable. You need to know what your target is so you can track progress over time. Second, value-centered. At this point in time, it's really not just enough to increase attainment, although of course that is important, but it's making sure that the credentials that folks are earning across the country are leading to meaningful opportunities and positive outcomes that set them on the pathway towards prosperity. Third, defining the populations that you intend to serve. We know that strong goals can help us understand where the gaps exist in each state and how to advance economic opportunity for all of your state's residents. Time bound, what are you trying to accomplish in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? It should be ambitious and also achievable and formally set through. That can be gubernatorial action, legislative, board, et cetera, but making sure that there is a clear commitment, ideally from a broad group of stakeholders. Next slide. And while we focus most of our attention on the development of state goals, this really just a prelude to taking action. And so on the left side of the slide, here are some of the ways that goals can drive policy and practice for change. They can shape state strategic plans, inform joint talent development strategies, align policy priorities around funding, program approval, grants, work-based learning opportunities, et cetera. And then on the right-hand side, you can see ways that they can be used to monitor progress. And really having a clear goal can help you strengthen the case for stronger data systems, generate interest in regular progress reports, and help you evaluate what's working and what's not. And when you know what's working, it gives you the opportunity to elevate and spread promising practices across states and systems. Next slide. And so this really just illustrates the work of building a North Star value-centered attainment goal, and that the work you do in your states, your SHIO offices, is built upon the work that other agencies and other partners are doing, both in workforce and economic development, K-12 and post-secondary, and Health and Human Services. And so, again, while you're thinking about how to develop the goal, how to and then operationalize it, having all of these folks engaged as key stakeholders will strengthen both the development and the implementation of the goal. And then finally, thinking about stakeholder engagement as a tool that's necessary, think about who in your ecosystem has what key engagement tools available to them. And, as you know, different stakeholders are playing different roles, but you want to engage folks who both have influence over the goal, the ability to approve it and champion it, and then um, really follow through on the policies and practices that follow from the goal itself. And I think one of the key takeaways is that achieving value-centric attainment and economic prosperity really depends on the wide range of stakeholders who can utilize these different sets of tools. And so, in a moment here, we are going to turn it over to the stars of the show from Maryland and Texas, who can share their experience and provide useful examples of how they've engaged broad coalitions of stakeholders to support their goals. But before hearing from Elena and Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to Madeline to guide you through a short engagement exercise.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so this is the point where we want to hear from you all to get a quick snapshot of where everyone is at in their stakeholder engagement process. And it's going to be a short 4 question survey. We'll set a foundation for the conversation and we'll really guide the rest of our discussion today, whether it's our conversations with Maryland and Texas or your own brainstorming about what comes next with stakeholder engagement. So here's a QR code if you would like to scan it on your phone. My colleague Jessica will also has also dropped a link in the chat. So I will pop over to the survey. And can I get a thumbs up of whether or not this is flipped over to Mentimeter?
Yeah.
Great. So the first question here is just understanding what the status of your stakeholder engagement is right now. You should get live responses on the screen as you go. Please select one. So just pick the one that best fits your state at this moment. I'm seeing a lot of the just getting started process, a few that have implemented a few strategies, but still trying to think about how the overall process fits together. Give a couple more minutes for responses. Okay. So mainly we're just getting started. So this is the perfect, I think, time to have this conversation with 2 states that have done it and have done it really effectively. So I'm really excited to see that moving forward. So our next question was really about the types of strategies. So what stakeholder engagement strategies are top of mind for you? How do you think you might want to approach this work moving forward? And here we know that a stakeholder engagement process is not one and done. So feel free to select multiple options that apply. This does not have to be only a single selection. So we're seeing a lot of targeted stakeholder conversations. So how do you identify those influencers, those champions, talk with them directly? Some people thinking more intentionally about a working group or steering committee. And then also just thinking about broad strategic messaging. So how do we communicate about the purpose of higher education, the value of higher education, and where we want the state to be moving? But really, I think there's a smattering across a lot of things. So. And then for this next question, who are you thinking about prioritizing? So here, feel free to kind of type in some specific stakeholder groups that are top of mind. If we have consistent things we can try to address, also Maryland and Texas's approach to these groups in our conversation moving forward. Governor's office for sure. Institutions. K-12 partners. So though these are post-secondary attainment goals, we know that that is not only reliant on post-secondary education. Pathways start in K-12. The students themselves are a potential stakeholder group to engage here. Employers also popping up as prominent. Give a few more seconds here. There are any additional groups to add? Higher ed associations, student affairs, schools. So moving on to our final question before we're going to jump into the discussion. We want to hear about your barriers. So what are the biggest barriers or challenges with stakeholder engagement in your state? And here, feel free to select up to three, maybe that stand out for you. We have capacity, buy-in, political transitions. Governor's office was mentioned several times in the previous question, and we know many states here are in gubernatorial elections, for example. Sustainability of engagement, I think, is popping out here. So, how do we keep stakeholders engaged throughout the process? Capacity and resource constraints. Stakeholder engagement takes time and sometimes other resources as well to accomplish. And there's also just some uncertainty about who to engage. So, who is best to bring into this process? Who are the right people to talk to? Okay. I'm going to close out here. And with that in mind, I'm going to move on to the discussion of who we would like to hear from today. So I'm excited to introduce Secretary Elena Quiroz-Livanes, Interim Secretary for the Maryland Higher Education Commission. Maryland, as you know, is one of the cohort states, so really excited here to highlight what a state in this collaborative has done throughout this work and how they are leading in goal setting. We're also really grateful to have Melissa Henderson, who is the Associate Commissioner for Strategic Partnerships at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board and Executive Director of the Texas Higher Education Foundation. So Texas is serving as a peer lead state in this collaborative. So this will be great because Maryland and Texas are at two different stages of the stakeholder engagement process. So we'll get to hear from various perspectives based off of where they're at, their experience, and what is next up on deck for them. I do want to note that there will be time for questions at the end, so please be thinking about what you would like to ask these two leaders while we have the opportunity and time. So I'm going to take down slides for the discussion so we can actually see our faces and encourage you all to go on camera as well so we can interact with these leaders. So to kick us off, both Maryland and Texas have really undergone robust stakeholder engagement processes to inform state plans for higher education. In Texas, that's the Building a Talent Strong Texas strategic plan, and Maryland's soon to be final, though not quite yet, state plan for higher education. So just to lay the foundations for this conversation, could you each briefly describe how you approach stakeholder engagement to inform those plans and ultimately your state attainment goals?
Sure, happy to jump in. Good morning, everyone, or at least good morning here in Texas. Good afternoon to those of you in the Eastern time zone. Again, Melissa Henderson, and I serve both as Chief of Staff to Commissioner Wayne Rosser here at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and also as executive director of the Texas Higher Education Foundation. So we're a couple of hats. Appreciate y'all having me with you today. So in Texas, when we were launching the work to revise the statewide strategic plan, which had been known as 60 by 30 prior to that, and wanted to, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that we started off wanting to add to the plan that ultimately became Building a Talent Strong Texas. But we knew we wanted to ground that in deep stakeholder engagement work. And so we had a few things that we launched at the beginning, sustained throughout, and other things that we undertook along the way. So we had a steering committee that met on a monthly basis throughout the work, so over about a little over a year, that was made up of some of our coordinating board members. So the coordinating board itself, which oversees the agency, those members are appointed by the governor and are the governing board for the agency. And then some members from the board of the Texas Higher Education Foundation, which is the official nonprofit partner to the agency. So that steering committee, as I said, met on a monthly basis across the course of the work. We also, so it's important to know that we launched this work in 2020. So in the midst of a pandemic, which I do not recommend, but we did it anyway. So we did a number of virtual listening sessions across the state because we wanted to hear from various regions, different stakeholders, different communities when they thought about the things that we were wanting to add to the plan. What did they see as the barriers, the opportunities? What did success look like in their communities? So we held 9 regional listening sessions, each with a hosting university and community college partner in those regions, and invited stakeholders representing other institutions, the business community, the philanthropic community, the nonprofit community, K-12. We really wanted to hear from them how they viewed this work. And then we held a 10th statewide listening session with the major metro chambers across the state. So really focusing that one on the business community. So I mentioned that we had some areas that we wanted to add to the plan. So when we launched this work, we knew that we wanted to take on adding value to the plan. So we've long had an attainment goal and a completion goal in Texas. But to Patrick's earlier point, ours was as it had been many states, attainment for attainment's sake, without this notion of value infused into it. And so we were really wanting to move that conversation forward to attainment with purpose and value, completion with purpose and value. So credentials of value is how we talk about that here in Texas. So that was one aspect of what we knew we wanted to look at. The second was around adding adult learners to our plan. So the prior plan had focused on 25 to 34-year-olds. We expanded that to 35 to 64-year-olds as well. And then the third area was around research and development and adding that back into the plan, which the 60 by 30 plan had been silent on, but of course is an important part of the mission of higher education across all of our institutions, or many of our institutions in all of our states. So those were the 3 areas. So the third area of stakeholder engagement was we had probably over 100 individual conversations with state and national experts in each of those spaces to hear where is the leading edge research on these issues, where is the expertise, what is the data, what does the research indicate as we think about each of these 3 areas. And then finally, we did, I think, 2 virtual summits where along the way, we invited people back who had participated in those regional listening sessions to reflect back to them, here's where we are, here's what we heard from you, here's what we're doing with it, and here's where we're headed. So those were kind of the component parts of our stakeholder engagement work.
Thank you. Certainly robust. Just a few things on that list, but Secretary, I'll pass it to you now.
I always learn so much hearing from our colleagues in Texas. So thanks for getting us started. And before jumping in, definitely want to express my gratitude to Lumina Foundation. It's wonderful to be a part of this cohort of states that are on the same journey, have learned a ton through these webinars, and our colleagues at HCM Strategists that are helping us bring the plan home. So nothing but gratitude. And I do want to recognize that my colleague Ann Kellogg from the Maryland Higher Education Commission, who is absolutely brilliant, and we would not be where we are on the state plan if it wasn't for her leadership, as well as 2 colleagues who are On leave, Dr. Emily Dow and Dr. Barbara Schmertz have been critical partners. So do just want to recognize their efforts and their partnership. And the last person that I want to recognize as we transition to talking about stakeholder engagement is my executive assistant, Alex Wen, who really is the one person who, without her, none of these meetings would have happened. And so just a shout out to our admins for the logistics and calendaring efforts, because without that, we would not have a chance to meet with everybody that we met with during our stakeholder planning. So to take a step back, Maryland is a state where we're required to develop a state plan for higher education every 4 years. And that state plan has 3 statutory components to it, which really drove the way that we approached engaging with our stakeholders. So we had to talk about academic and research, and this is a first time, similar to Texas, that we delved into the research side. Typically, we have stayed on the academics. So academics and research, we have to do an assessment of the present and future needs of the state in these 2 areas. Then we have to assess the capacity of the individual institutions, the segments, and the system as a whole to address those needs. And then the third component of the state plan is setting short-term and long-term objectives for the state. So really with that statutory grounding, we told ourselves that's wonderful. How do we make sure that this is also beyond a compliance exercise, and that we're not just developing a plan to develop a plan, but really using this to drive policy and broader transformation here in the state. And a lot of those lessons learned, actually having been a former staffer at the Massachusetts Department of Education, higher education, and learned a lot through the talent innovation and equity process, which was funded by Lumina a couple of years ago. So really with that in mind, in the past, when we had focused on the academic component of the state plan, we engaged mostly with our institutions of higher education. We really were approaching this slightly different because there was a few goals that we had in mind in addition to meeting the statutory components. And one was to really start to challenge the conversation that was happening in the field and about our field regarding the value of higher education. So when we were starting to think about stakeholders, we were starting to think about who could partner with us to really tell the story about the value of higher education. Then we also knew that we needed to introduce different folks into the mix because we typically have engaged with only institutions of higher education in the state planning process. And so in this case, we really decided to go beyond institutions of higher education. So we formed a steering committee. And so we had about 30 people in our steering committee. They represented all 6 segments of higher education. So here in Maryland, MHEC is the only entity that has oversight of the entire post-secondary ecosystem. So that includes our 16 community colleges, our research universities, our regional comprehensives, the independent institutions. We also have oversight over 150 private career schools in the state, and as well as Morgan and St. Mary's. So we're the only ones that have insight into how the entire ecosystem is working. So we invited representatives from all of those segments. We also invited representatives from across state government to sit on our steering committee. And the reason for that is we felt like this was Maryland's state plan for higher education and not MHEC's state plan for higher education. And that really speaks to, under Governor Moore, this whole of government approach to the work that we do. So we really wanted to make sure that for the first time, we were also using this planning process to break down silos within state government that would prevent us from meeting the goals of the plan. We also invited folks based on what we thought we would need once we move from development to implementation. So one of the things that you'll see really being a key point in our strategic state plan is strengthening the connection between higher education and workforce and industry. So for the first time, our steering committee included the president of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce, a number of intermediary organizations like the Maryland Tech Council. We also included philanthropy, knowing that there may be opportunities to seek additional resources when we go from that pilot to policy phase, right? Thinking about state plan implementation. So we invited philanthropic partners. We also invited community-based organizations that receive grants from the Maryland Higher Education Commission, recognizing that they work closely with our students, particularly in the K through 12 college access and outreach space. So I want to make sure that the folks that were closest to the ground had a voice on our steering committee, in addition to commissioners, and our student commissioner was also on the steering committee. So the steering committee was really intentional in thinking about statute as well as implementation. Now, we brought the steering committee together 8 times over the course of the past 12 months. So we convened them for the first time last July. They met monthly during the summer and fall semester. And then we pivoted to a working group structure in the spring. And this allowed us to dive a bit deeper into some of the conversations that we were having in a steering committee as far as policies and priorities. The last thing I'll say, 2 more things. We had a series of stakeholder sessions throughout the planning process. So even if you were a member of the steering committee, we had a one-on-one session with you. We've had a one-on-one session with many major businesses here in the state, as well as major employers. We've had conversations, like I mentioned, one-on-one with philanthropy, especially those philanthropic organizations that were not represented on the steering committee. And then we've also had the final piece, which was interesting, and this was a recommendation that came from President Wilson. We had a red team read the final version of the state plan. So these were folks at the national level, similar to what Melissa had described, that were not involved in the state plan development process, but we then gave an embargoed version of the state plan to, and we solicited their feedback to make sure that we weren't missing anything that was happening at the national level. And I will tell you, those red team members and our HCM colleagues helped us parse through some of these comments. They were really trying to get us to push the envelope in a way. And so that is I do wish that we had given them an opportunity to read the plan maybe at the halfway point and at the end point. Red teams typically come in at the end, but that was a very useful exercise for us to make sure that what we were putting forward at the state level would resonate at the national level. Because again, we are trying to contribute to this ongoing dialogue in protecting what we do in higher education when so many folks are attacking our day-to-day work.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. You speak very eloquently, I think, about the need to broaden the stakeholders beyond the kind of usual higher education suspects that you have engaged in previous state plans. And I know that one stakeholder group you both mentioned that we've also discussed a lot in this collaborative is business and industry. So could you both speak to the role that business and industry stakeholders ended up playing in your respective stakeholder engagement processes?
Sure, happy to jump in, and then love to hear from Secretary Quiros Ivanes. So for us, it started with, well, I don't want to say started with, actually, it both was in the listening sessions that we held on a regional basis, where we wanted to hear from regional employers as part of that conversation of what does this look like when you think about your community as a member of your community. So wanted to make sure that perspective was represented both in those conversations as well as the dedicated business listening session that was kind of broader and more what do you need from higher ed in a statewide sense. And then what I think we have seen post the launch of the plan is continued engagement from the business community in some of the things that have then followed as we have been implementing the Building a Talent Strong Texas plan. So I think having them involved on the front end and having them have a seat at the table in helping shape what those goals looked like has then led to ongoing engagement in different ways on different topics, but has set the stage for us to continue to have that engagement from the business community, which I think is important.
Yeah, very, very similar here in Maryland. So they were included from the beginning as members of our steering committee, and they also, like I mentioned, we've had a lot of individual stakeholder sessions with major employers, and it's been helpful for a few reasons. One is to validate the direction of the goals. So I will tell you that the term credentials of value gets very little love in the state of Maryland. We had to come up with our own term which we actually did it in Indianapolis, which was wonderful, in a session with Julie while we were brainstorming and trying to figure out what direction we could go in. And language really matters. So we knew that we would keep bumping into this. And so we've coined a term, or we will coin a term called lighthouse degrees and credentials. Our Department of Commerce has these things called lighthouse sectors: aerospace, biotechnology, quantum, and cybersecurity. And they have identified fields where we know that we hope to compete in as a state and attract more business and industry. And so we've come up with this term, lighthouse degrees and credentials. Once we got over the terminology, we got back to the work of goal setting. And I don't mean to say that, I don't mean to downplay that, but that was really important. And so business partners were very helpful in the value conversation and reminding us that there is still an ivory tower in which people perceive us to policy from. And so they constantly invited us to come back, and I don't want to say touch grass, but definitely make sure that we were speaking to one of our biggest constituents. And so I will just sidetrack for a moment to say, I think individuals' positionality and how you show up to this work really matters. And so, like, all of us showing up from MHEC, we're coming from the higher ed perspective, and we recognize that we had our own limitations. So having business really helped say some of the things that we couldn't say. So once we got over the language, and once business continued to say degrees and credentials matter, but at the same time, we need to make sure that they're aligned with what it is that we need, we were able to remind ourselves of the public mission of higher education and the fact that part of what we do is workforce development. So if we are responsible for workforce and talent development, where are we getting that information from? And so the state plan actually does require us to complete what's known as a workforce needs analysis, where the Maryland Higher Education Commission comes together with the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor and looks at projections to see what are the areas that we know will have projected shortages in. So again, having business come back to validate and say that workforce needs analysis is not a static analysis. Institutions of higher education, you should really be using that to modify your existing programs. We've done a lot in the state of Maryland to make it easier for institutions of higher education to modify their existing programs in order to align with workforce demand. We also had business and industry validate that list and say, we know that we are going to need talent in these areas. Can you develop programs in these spaces? So they helped us see this workforce needs analysis, which in many ways, again, was being used to determine whether or not you could duplicate a program. And they're saying, here's the information and the data that you need in order to be more responsive to our needs. Now, at the same time, we use this opportunity to say, like, business, that's great. We know that you need a lot from us. It actually looks like we need a lot from you too. So while we'll work with our sister agencies to develop an employer engagement strategy, we're over here at the same time thinking about workforce Pell, for example, and there's a 70% placement rate. There might be some programs that just miss that 70% placement rate, for example. They might be at 65. Would you be willing to work with us to create pipelines for students that are graduating in these programs, which you have said you have a demand for, in order for our programs to have access to workforce Pell? So it was very much meant to be reciprocal. It started off with, like, this is what you need from us, but at the same time, we know that we're going to need some things from you. The last thing I'll leave you with in this case that we're also leveraging these relationships around is career connected experiential learning. We know that we want to give our students equitable access to high quality career connected experiential learning, whether that's work-based learning, internships, externships, capstones, case studies, but we can't do that on our own in higher education. We need those close partnerships with small, medium, and large businesses. So really using this state plan, again, as an opportunity to say, you say that's valuable, business and industry, that's wonderful. We're willing to build it. Can you meet us in the middle to make sure that our students have placements? Because otherwise we're creating something and it's going to lead to a road to nowhere. So again, I would offer that we had some things in mind where we knew that we would be able to provide business and industry what we needed, but there were also some things that we know that we needed on the higher ed side. So really trying to treat this as a reciprocal relationship was a valuable approach for us. And people like to be asked to help. So that was an approach that worked for us in Maryland.
Secretary, that's really helpful. I want to stick with you for a moment and pull on a thread that you mentioned at the beginning here. You mentioned some concerns that campuses raised about the term value and that there was no love lost for that in Maryland. Of course, value centered, or at least that concept, is one of the elements that Patrick mentioned as a strong element of attainment goal moving forward. So, how did you navigate those concerns and how did you address that with your various stakeholders throughout this process?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Madeline. And so a few a few things, and I'm sure most of you on the call can appreciate what it's like working with our campus partners, and they are incredibly important and their concerns should be validated. So we did validate that, right? Like they are feeling we were coming into this space wanting to, I don't necessarily want to say protect them because that's not true. There are so many things that want to change, but this had to be a safe space for them when everybody else was attacking higher ed. So that was one thing that we could do as a commission. And we worked together to identify alternative framing. What we did say, and this is part of what worked, is that like regardless of how, whether or not we even believe in the argument that higher education's value should be questioned, it is happening. And so, like, we can either put our heads in the sand and reject that conversation and just continue to do what we do, or we can be in direct dialogue with the people who are having these conversations. And so we said we would prefer to be in direct dialogue as a commission, and we believe that that is our purview and our responsibility as a state higher education executive office or agency. So we started to pivot to say, how are we then going to enter into the value conversation as Maryland to basically say that higher education continues to have value? And then how are we going to measure value? So once people, and HCM team knows that up until the very last steering committee, right, like had to continue to reframe and remind institutions of higher education that this was not meant to be punitive, but it was meant allowed to give us a little bit more so we can fight back. Now, how are we fighting back? That's with data. And so, like, I think this is where things also got really interesting. And we said that there's a few things that we want to look at. So, in addition to adopting the Lumina goal, which is looking at what individuals make compared to high school earners, so we still have that. That has not changed. We're going to have our own value-centered framework, if you will, and we probably won't call it that, but we're framing it around social and economic mobility here in Maryland. So the way that we're going to measure mobility, aka value, is a few things, and it is at the programmatic level. So you got institutions of higher education to agree there, but we're going to look at beyond your typical return on investment measures like debt to earnings ratios and those types of thresholds. We're going to be looking at, and we did learn some lessons from Louisiana, but Anne has really been driving here. We're going to be looking at wage growth and growth over time. So 1, 3, 5 years, 10 years out. We're going to be looking at labor market stability and how seamlessly our graduates enter into the labor market. How long are they in the labor market for? Ideally, we'll also have the capacity to determine whether or not they entered into the labor market in a field that is associated with their discipline on the post-secondary side. So we got a lot of agreement on how to think about and measure value. So we set the value conversation, we set the language aside. We said, can we agree on how to measure it? Give us some time to think about the framing. By the time they agreed on the measurements, we came back to an alternative on the frame. And then everything kind of converged in the middle. And so we're now in a really good place where we have some proposed indicators that we'll work on fleshing out. We have the plan going before the commission in June. But again, I have to say, like, the business community also kind of drilled down on, like, this is pretty important for us to be able to measure. And we said, while that's wonderful, these wages also reflect what you're willing to pay our people. So in many ways, this is also a reflection of you and your performance as much as it is a reflection on the performance of institutions of higher education. So again, like that reciprocity piece. And I think our institutions of higher education really appreciated the fact that any chance that we could advocate on their behalf, they saw the agency doing that. And that helped us build some trust and credibility, which is incredibly important as you're doing statewide goal setting.
Thank you. I appreciate you going a little bit more in depth into that, as I'm certain it's not Other states are likely experiencing similar conversations and similar tensions as this conversations unfolds. Melissa, turning to you, kind of pulling a thread on something you mentioned earlier, you talked about sustained engagement of the business community, but I'm certain that also applies to other stakeholders in this work. And that is something that maybe emerged as a challenge in our quick Mentimeter survey at the beginning. So could you speak a little bit more about the strategies Texas used to implement and facilitate sustained engagement throughout the process?
Sure. So a couple of things. One, trying to think where to start. So I would say there is sustained engagement with the business community in a couple of ways specifically, and then I can talk about other audiences. So with the business community specifically, we have a group that we convene on a quarterly basis that we call the Commissioners Economic and Workforce Council, that is made up of major chambers from across the state, industry associations, economic development corporations. So that gives us a venue to have ongoing dialogue with them, not specifically about the plan necessarily, but here are the things that we're working on, here are the things that we're wrestling with, here are our priorities. What are you seeing from your communities, your industries, et cetera, as we move through various initiatives? A great example of that is around community college finance. So post the adoption of the plan, so the plan was adopted January of 22. There was at the same time, somewhat in parallel, a commission that had been created by the legislature in 2021 that was looking at how to revise our community college funding model. That legislation was then adopted in 2023. And credentials of value is really at the heart of that funding model. And I would say the business community has been very engaged, both through our council, but also more broadly in those conversations around community college funding. As you can imagine, that is extremely relevant for many of their employers, their industries, et cetera, as they think about those workforce shortages, those workforce needs, and reorienting the community college funding model to be more responsive to those needs. So we went from a model that was predominantly seat time based, as many funding models are, to one that is 95% based on outcomes. One of the key outcomes within that is attainment of completion of credential of value, with additional weight for if that credential of value is in a high demand field. And for us in Texas, going back to some of the secretary's comments, when we think about value, we think about it in terms of, are you better off? Are you as a student, are you as an individual better off within 10 years than you would be relative to a high school graduate? And when we look at that at the population level, all of our bachelor's degrees surpass that threshold. Now, when you look at that by individual campus, individual student demographics, that's where the work is, right? But for us, it allowed us to have a different conversation than, is this specific program of value to, are you as an institution delivering that value for your students? And that allowed us to set the stage for a little bit of a different conversation. So with the business community, I would say that is one way that we have continued to keep them engaged. The community college funding model was an initiative coming out of the adoption of the plan, around which they have very much engaged, in addition to the ways that we also engage institutions and other stakeholders throughout that process. And those are obviously separate initiatives, but I think very connected in terms of holding credential of value at the center of both.
Thank you. And I think across both of these examples, right, you've talked a little bit about navigating the politics of this work, whether it's through legislation that passes, through your stakeholder engagement, through specific language choices. What were the top kind of political factors that you would recommend states keep in mind when designing and implementing stakeholder engagement processes?
Yeah, I think for us, a couple of things. One, in Texas, and I'm sure we're not alone in this, jobs, economic opportunity, those types of messages really resonate. Both what we have found is both with the general public and with legislators. As part of our work to develop the plan, adopt the goals, we also did some message testing along the way, to make sure that we were hearing the perspective of the general public in how we were talking about this work and making sure that we were talking about it in a way that was easily digestible, understandable, resonated, etc. So that was incredibly helpful for us as we thought about not just what are the goals, but how do we talk about them? How do we frame them? Are we making sure that this resonates?
That
Secretary, I welcome your responses as well here.
that resonates. Everything that was just shared, totally agree. I mean, for us, there's a few maybe Maryland specific things that were also helpful from a political standpoint. So the first was that our governor, who's absolutely incredible, he initiated for the first time a state plan for the state. So he developed a state plan that had 10 priorities. So for us, being a state agency, the secretary's position is gubernatorially appointed. We have a commission; those members are gubernatorial appointees. So we had to have an understanding of like what was the state's agenda and then how did higher ed fit into that. So that is very much how we have approached this, which is also why we had so many of our sister agencies here. And so there's politics with the little p, which is partially why we had our sister agencies like Labor's, Commerce, K through 12 Governor's Workforce Development Board. And that gave us an opportunity to align as well on those little p politics, which helps when you're talking to other constituents like institutions of higher education. For us, also being mindful that he is up for reelection. So that's just the reality of where we are with our state plan development. There's an election happening here in November. Primaries are 10 days away. So that was something to keep in mind. And we were developing this state plan in the middle of what felt like a pretty heated legislative session. So thinking about members of the General Assembly and how they would interact with the commission during its development was something that we also had definitely kept in mind. And then obviously the federal environment changed since 2024. And so being mindful of that, being mindful of language. One thing that I'll share, and I when I heard, about the message testing from Texas, which is absolutely brilliant. That is, I think, very much like what we are also in the middle of doing. And I'll give you an example. We currently, there's a lot of framing around not everybody needs a 4-year degree, which we agree with, but perhaps is not the way that we would like to talk about post-secondary education. I'm also told that post-secondary education is too wonky. And that even that term post-second, like we don't call it secondary here in the United States. I was born in Honduras where we call it secundaria, so everybody would know what that is, but here we call it high school. So framing things like education beyond high school, which folks might recall came from the Biden administration, but trying to see whether or not that is something that would land more positively with our elected officials who are frankly looking for sound bites. In addition to big policy wins. So that's part of it is, again, who are you talking for and how do you talk in a language that they can understand? So a lot of appreciation for the Texas approach and wanting to make sure that it all resonates because it can get wonky really, really fast.
Mm-hmm. And certainly different stakeholders are looking for different things out of these processes. Melissa, one of the things I think Texas has done really effectively is having a really clear, digestible, and succinct plan, while it still introduces pretty complex topics like the credentials of value definition that you all have used across numerous kind of policies and practices, in addition to it being featured in your state plan. So, how did you approach that distillation of a complex topic in a very clear way so that stakeholders could understand it through your state plan?
Sure. So a couple of things. One, I think, to a lot of this conversation, continuing conversations with policymakers along the way will help inform how you think about that, right? You see what lands, you see where there are questions, you see what resonates, you hear things like the secretary is talking about with, the messaging around not everyone needs a 4-year degree. So how do you adapt your language and how you're framing things to adjust for what questions people are hearing from their constituents and otherwise. So I think continuing to keep them engaged in the process will help you continue to think about that framing along the way. We had two versions of the plan. So we have a kind of brief version that is intended for a policymaker, general public audience that is very digestible, that is visually appealing and is designed for that audience. And then we also have a longer form version that we refer to as the reference guide version, where if you are an institutional researcher, if you are a practitioner on a campus, that's the version that is more built for you. It's where all the methodological information is. It's where we really dig into the weeds. That while the concepts are the same across both, it's the level of granularity and what how we are giving various stakeholder groups what they need in order to digest and understand the plan, the methodology, the data sources, et cetera. And so I think, we were intentional in how we built those two versions and how we developed various materials, whether that was slide decks, whether that was talking points, whether that was the versions of the plan themselves, so that we were speaking to different audiences at that different level of granularity.
And Secretary in Maryland, I know your team has also kind of experienced a push-pull between a desire for simplicity and clarity for communication while also wanting more detail in the plan of, well, we need to acknowledge this and where do we pull in this? How are you all addressing that balance in the final state plan while still staying true to addressing all your stakeholder feedback?
We wouldn't be able to do it without HCM. So I was like, how do I mean, like, that's just like that's the truth. And so I think having really smart partners is part of it. And so, our steering committee and even our commission has a desire to know what is happening. So the plan is supposed to be adopted, fingers crossed, by the commission on June 24th, and then submitted to the General Assembly by July 1st. And so they want to know, like, what are we going to do on July 2nd? And part of it is take a breath and process what we just went through, but really starting to think about implementation. And they wanted, by the day, what was going to happen first, what indicators were going to launch on what day, what strategies were going to be implemented, and what time frame, when were you going to bring all of the working groups together, and how many working groups were there going to be. And all of those are really valid questions. I mean, we have the same, at some point you tire of writing and you want to get to action. So I can understand where they're coming from. I can also tell you, having written a 10-year strategic plan for racial equity that was incredibly prescriptive and said what we would be doing from day 1 to year 10 was unrealistic. Because things change in ways that you cannot necessarily predict. So the plan had to have enough direction, but also enough wiggle room. And so there's an implementation section in the state plan, which is a new section, which talks about how we're going to, one, develop a strategic plan for the agency, which the Maryland Higher Education Commission has never had a strategic plan. So that'll be incredibly important and is distinct from a state plan. But two, we let people know what our priorities were. We committed to convening working groups. We committed to bringing our sister agencies together along for the ride. But we told ourselves that we couldn't be prescriptive. And we were very upfront about that throughout the plan. We said these were some things, for example, on the indicators that we know that we would like to collect the data on, but we don't have that data right now. So the plan would be a really good place to put that stake in the ground and say, we'll start some data collections. But that doesn't mean that you can then put results out the year after you started. Well, depending on the data collection, sometimes you need 4 years worth of data in order to put outcomes. So that was a constant negotiation, and we landed in a place where we gave folks just enough. We gave them ideas and priorities. We called things potential performance indicators. And then this is part of the sustainability of the plan. We said we would update the plan on an annual basis. And there's a deep commitment to continuous improvement. So I think happy to share the plan when it's done. I think we did a nice, without patting ourselves on the back, like a nice job of giving just enough details without being overly prescriptive.
Well, and hopefully that encourages the sustained engagement as well that we talked about moving forward, as there is still, of course, more to do. Okay, flagging for the audience. I just have two more quick questions and then we'll pass it to you all. So please be thinking about if there are any questions you would like to ask our panelists. So looking back on your stakeholder engagement processes, what were your biggest successes and maybe lessons learned that you would like to impart upon this group here today?
So I think for us, one success was, and I mentioned the community college funding model a little bit ago. So that was pretty quickly on the heels of adopting the plan. And yet, I think I think socializing the concept of credential of value for us as we were revising the goals and centering the goals on credential of value so that folks had a sense of what we mean by that term before we then tried to reorient a funding model and make policy change around that concept. I think separating those two things out was a success, right? So that when we went into those conversations around how do we reorient the community college funding model, there was already an understanding, at least at some level, of what do we mean by credential of value. So I think for us, that was an important win. Challenge, I wouldn't do this during a pandemic. That was less than ideal, and I realize hopefully that will not be the case for anything. But I also raise that. I mean, I raise that somewhat jokingly, but also I think there is always going to be something that makes it hard to get this work done. And I think adaptability and agility throughout this process was key. In our instance, that was because we were navigating the constraints of a pandemic, but we saw that in other ways too, right? Like I used to say this was always on some level going to be an exercise in iteration. We knew going into it that we wanted to look at this notion of value, that we wanted to incorporate adult learners, and that we wanted to refocus on research and development. But there was a lot that we didn't know going into it. We knew that we had questions, and we knew that we were going to have to find answers. And so I think that agility and that adaptability along the way is really important.
I love letting Texas go first because I can just say ditto. And Melissa, I don't know to refer to you as chief or executive director because you have the benefit of wearing two different hats. But ditto to everything the chief executive director just said. And I similarly for us, there is a few things. So we started this plan development last July, but had attempted goal setting the previous year, and that did not go well for us. And so I can't underscore enough the socialization process and making sure that all of your interest holders, particularly institutions of higher education, feel comfortable with the direction that you're going in. And I'm kind of thinking back to something that Dr. Thompson said last time we met or at one of our previous webinars when he talked about the importance of connecting with institutions of higher education because ultimately they're responsible for so much of the implementation. So that socialization, those jokes that I was making about lighthouse degrees and credentials, they're not jokes because at the end of the day, folks can thwart your plans. So that really matters. And I think for us, it was helpful to have multiple voices. The other piece and part of why I chuckled is that there is the agility really matters. There is a major leadership transition in the middle of our planning process here in the state of Maryland, and so our capacity changed earlier this spring. And again, thank you to HCM for their willingness to support us. But I think being agile and nimble, and frankly having a strong team internally, that would be a major success for us. I think. If you ever want to hear inside jokes between a group of friends, feel free to come to one of the Maryland Tiger team meetings because I would say that we're also better colleagues for the work and have a sense of appreciation for each other's expertise. And that has been a major success as someone who cares about organizational health. And I do think we were able to rebuild the credibility of the agency through this process. There were a lot of questions around what is a commission capable of doing? And we were dipping our toes in research and innovation, which is very closely tied to economic development. And so I think this process allowed us to show that we're willing to try new things and we're humble enough to understand when we need to bring in those outside experts complement our expertise. So socialization, having those diverse folks who can then validate the work that you're doing. I'm hopeful that we're going to have a ton of statements of support when the state plan comes out, and that those statements of support aren't just coming from institution of higher education, but folks from across the state. And the fact that we now have a really strong team of folks who have always been there, but have ownership of the plan and can help us see it through during implementation, I would say is another success for us here in Maryland.
Thank you both. And before we open it up to the group for questions, just noting that about 2/3 of this group was at the just getting started phase when we did our survey at the beginning. So, what's one piece of advice you would give states on where to start?
I think for us, one, I think it was really important for us going into this work to know these are the three areas that we're focused on because it helped orient so many things, including the stakeholder engagement. It helped us orient the questions when we were going into those regional listening sessions to be able to engage folks around these broad topic areas and hear from a variety of stakeholders, again, kind of what they saw from the perspective of their community, their perspective in their community, their space in their community. What does success look like as we think about incorporating adult learners? What do you see as the challenges when we think about research and development for your community? So it gave us a really concrete place to start, particularly in our stakeholder engagement and otherwise, but particularly with our stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, similarly, I think working backwards really helped. So we knew what the three goals were, broadly speaking: attainment and completion, measuring value, and research and innovation. And then really moving backwards from there helped with the design of the steering committee composition, and then thinking about implementation. So like, where is it that we wanted to go and who would we need from an implementation perspective was another piece. And then I'll offer that this is a really messy process. And I have hope to convey nothing but mess and organized chaos through my comments. But it is not neat. It is not linear. There is a lot of negotiation that happens. And so as a team, being honest with yourself around like, what are the non-negotiables? And then like everything else can be negotiated. And there were very few non-negotiables, I'll be honest. Like there's just so much, because at the end of the day, we're a SHIO. I'm sitting on the 21st floor in the Inner Harbor, very far removed, unfortunately, from the students that will be most impacted by this plan. So then just being honest with ourselves about like, what is it that we could not let go of? And like I said, being willing to engage in the mess. And as they say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'll tell you that continuous improvement language and being able to update the plan on an annual basis, I think gave us permission as a team to say perfect is not the goal, progress is.
Thank you both so much for your time. I would love to pass it to the audience now, and feel free to drop questions in the chat, which I can read out, or come off mute and ask the questions to our panelists directly.
I'll let folks keep marinating on their questions, and I'll throw one out. First of all, Melissa and Elena, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And Elena, I love the last thing you said, that, perfect isn't the goal, progress is, which I think just really encapsulates this work. And you both touched on this in somewhat different ways, but I'd love to hear you go a little bit deeper about kind of negotiating between institutions and other stakeholders. And it's not just like the business community and legislators, it's probably others, but every state, there are stakeholders who have really different perspectives on what higher education is doing for the state and students. And I think Melissa, you mentioned some of the tension around calling programs like credentials of value, because it sort of implies that, well, some are of value, then others aren't. And I'm sure institutional stakeholders believe that all are of value. And at the same time, that value shows up differently. And you want this plan to um, have buy-in from institutions and from the business community and legislators. So, how do you thread that needle and find that middle ground between the different folks who are engaged in this process?
I mean, I think for us, I would go back to something the secretary said earlier, that it goes back to the data, right? So, and I mentioned this, when we looked at the population level at particularly our bachelor's degrees, what we found was that at the population level, all of the bachelor's degrees that are offered in our state surpassed that threshold. So for all of the programs, we were able to say to our institutional partners, great news. All of the bachelor's degrees that you're offering at a population level surpass this threshold. By and large, students are better off than they otherwise would have been if they hadn't pursued that degree. Now, that then became important to be able to share back with institutions what their data showed by institution. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, that's really where the work is, because when we broke it out by institution and by student demographics, not every student graduating from every institution in every program is getting to realize the potential value of that degree. So I think for us, I mean, it is a careful threading of the needle, right? And I think for us, being able to demonstrate with data what that means for what stakeholder at what level was important.
I I would agree that the data has helped, and there's a lot of tools that we have because of Dr. Kellogg, and we have a really robust state longitudinal data system center. So there is a lot of trust also in the way that the MLDSC uses the data and is then presented. So there's just data and being data informed and evidence driven. That I will offer that so going back to the steering committee composition, um, I'll start with the failure of our goal setting process. And we fail forward. So we had initially wanted to introduce the new attainment goals vis-a-vis legislation through the General Assembly. And two of the six segments of higher education were not supportive. And I would say we did not do a good job of socializing those goals before putting them forward. So that was like step number one, and those are bad. And I think if we had socialized them ahead of time, it would have gone differently. But what I then came to realize is that you had two segments speaking for six. And so all six segments of higher education and post-secondary education needed to be invited to the table around goal setting. So community colleges ended up being my like biggest advocate. Like, so part of it is like creating the room and making sure that like there was some fragmentation that happened on purpose. So like we leaned in on the fact that community colleges might feel differently about, for example, this credentials of value, credentials language versus universities that may not like want to be assessed in this way, which is somewhat ironic. But so like one, that table setting was really important. So that's just like another thing that I would offer is like who is in the room really matters, and being intentional then in like how you design the conversations. I could count on the community colleges to say credentials should be counted. Because there was a question that there was a moment where we weren't going to include anything below sub-associate, which is not the direction the field is going in. So leaning in on your partners and letting them sometimes do the work for you was incredibly helpful. And then like we would come in and say, well, we have to figure out what the common ground is amongst all of you. Here's where the and statements start to pop up. And so like leaning in on ands versus ors, I think was also really important for us, and slash or rather than just one or the other. So that's just the other piece that I would offer is sometimes if you have the right people in the room, you just have to sit back and do the work as long as the design was intentional up front. And then there are just some places, Patrick, where we would not concede. So like even though we are using the term degrees and credentials, I think I said time and time again, we do not agree that credentials isn't an umbrella term. But for now, between now and 2030, we will use degrees and credentials. And starting 2030, when all of you feel comfortable, we will drop the credentials and only use we will drop degrees and only use credentials. There are other places too where institutions aren't used to us playing this statewide work. So there are some places where we're just not, like you put the stake in the ground and say, we're the only state agency that has purview over 6 segments. This is a role that we're going to have to play. And that again goes back to like, what are the non-negotiables? And there were some places where we knew, for example, transfer was a non-negotiable. We're not going to play a role in transfer. Whether or not our university system partners want us to play a role in transfer, we have to play a role in transfer. So again, intentionality of who is invited to the table to negotiate really matters. And then having a sense of your non-negotiables up front can be really helpful. And then like sticking to what it is. And actually the last thing I'll offer, it's really helpful when you have a strong commission. So like I really want to recognize our chair, Cassie Motts. Like there's just some things too, like our non-negotiables, some of them came from her. So when you have a commission, this external entity that is ultimately responsible for governance and adopting this, and they're the ones signaling, we will not adopt this plan unless it says ABC, that is also really powerful.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions? I know this is a lot of information being thrown at you, so I will transition us to really an opportunity to reflect on what this means for your state. So we've heard a lot, but we want this work of the collaborative and this webinar specifically to be actionable. So my colleague Jessica is going to, once I reshare my screen, share a link to a Canva board. If you click on that link, you can access an opportunity to take notes on what your are 2 things you can do in the next 1 to 2 months to move the needle on stakeholder engagement in your state. When you click in, it might ask you to create an account. You don't need an account to do this, just exit out of that. And you will be able to see this whiteboard with various sticky notes, and just feel free to take the next couple of minutes to write down some ideas of actions you could take to make progress on stakeholder engagement. So feel free to grab any sticky note. You will be able to see what your colleagues and peers in this collaborative are writing. So hopefully this not only allows you to think about what your next steps are, but get ideas from other states about what you might implement to further stakeholder engagement, start it, or strengthen the processes that you already have in process. So I will pause to give everyone a chance to fill this out. Give people a couple more minutes to fill out sticky notes. Feel free to grab any across the page. Just consider what this might mean for your state. Seen a lot about stakeholder identification. Um, Also noting the need to kind of broaden engagement as well as connect that broader engagement to existing work happening. So what are these organic opportunities many states are already pursuing? A lot of enhanced collaboration. How can we build this goal setting into that process? Also seeing the definition work of, how will we actually define these terms in various states? It won't necessarily be the same. So what does that work look like? Who needs to be brought in for input? And then what does buy-in really mean for that? Would anyone like to comment on kind of some of their reflections or their identified next steps in their state? I might pick on Illinois here. So Shane, I'm so sorry. I see you. Um, do you want to jump off of mute and maybe speak to how implications might connect to the Illinois State Attainment Working Group process? I see you wrote some about employer engagement and defining specific terms.
Yeah, I would just say what good, thoughtful, informative information Texas and Maryland have provided today. I think we're still relatively early in our process, but I hear so many important pieces to this. And thinking about the stakeholder engagement as an ongoing process in the design and throughout and in the implementation and in the years that follow until you get closer to that goal, I'm hearing from both of you um, the thoughtfulness in thinking about how institutions feel about this and ensuring the comfort of how we define the different terms, I think is so important. I heard the importance of so important the employer piece, not just the agencies that are the related agencies, but the chambers of commerce and the big employers in the state, and bringing those voices in and making sure they're part of the discussion. No, just so many things I've heard today have been helpful.
Thank you for allowing me to pick on you.
Or
Someone wrote tying together the many different projects that will help define state attainment goals. Anyone willing to speak on like what those projects are and where that alignment is most important in your state? Not sure who wrote it, but
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, we've gone through multiple different productivity funding model that has been a big push, and getting return on investment involved in that, and then that just ties right into the whole state attainment stuff. We're pretty early stages of that as well. But then we've also been, trying to tie in credentials of value, and so just kind of they're kind of in silos right now, and they need to, if we can get them more tied together, then it might be a good way to then engage some of those stakeholders.
thank you, Blake. Any other comments or questions coming up from this exercise where we're thinking about like, okay, we have all this information. What does this mean for our next steps? Okay, I won't pick on anyone else, but want to ensure that we give Elena and Melissa time for any kind of final thoughts or words based off of today's conversation, and some of these next steps that participants have identified? What final parting words for advice do you have for these various states leading stakeholder engagement processes around goal setting?
One, again, just a ton of gratitude and can appreciate what it feels like to be at the very beginning of the process, and we'll be at the very beginning in 4 more years. So it's cyclical like that. The just a few parting thoughts again, like progress over perfection is definitely a helpful frame. I can't underscore the value of teamwork, especially having seen the capacity constraints responses, and that's also just coming from the level of gratitude that I have for the MHEC team. What I'll share is that we approach this a little differently because attainment means something different than completion. And I think a theme that I have come back to is like the importance of work. So like looking at this from the attainment lens is that this is also not higher education's problem to solve alone was a very helpful framing for us. Completion is what we contribute to the attainment conversation. And we did have almost like a post-mortem of what did we learn from the last time we set an attainment goal and how can that inform the setting of a new one, which is where we learned we have to decouple completion and attainment. And so again, like coming back to that definition, if you're looking at the number of adults in the labor force that have a post-secondary credential that meet a certain threshold, I do think that invites also a certain level of creativity that is really fun to explore and play with. And that's what I think also just highlighted for us the need for greater partnership, which then led to such a diverse steering committee of folks that represented so many individuals outside of higher education. So that might sound pedantic, but attainment is not completion. And coming back to who is everybody who needs to be involved in a talent strategy, retention, recruitment conversation can really help inform the work and perhaps even lessen some of the pressure on the SHIO, as that is really a statewide responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just underscore so much of what the secretary said, so much of what we've said throughout this conversation, and would underscore this work always starts somewhere, right? And it doesn't happen overnight, and it can feel really big and really daunting. And you start with the first step, and then you go to the next one, and then you go to the next one, right? And that knowing concretely your non-negotiables on the front end, but being willing to adapt and be agile and negotiate what is negotiable along the way as you take this work on is really important to ultimately getting to a place that works for higher ed and works for the state overall.
Well, thank you both. We really appreciate the time. Having leaders who have done this work is so helpful to inform everyone else who is jumping in. And I think in a year we will have many more examples of really, really robust stakeholder engagement work around this. So I will pass it to Patrick to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. And thank you again, Melissa and Elena, for taking the time to join us today and share your experiences and your hard-earned battle scars from going through this process. Just reflecting back a couple things that I heard you both talk about today. One is the importance of socializing your plan, your process, your goals with institutions and with the business community and other stakeholders. It sounds like you probably can't talk about this enough, and that will sort of smooth the process along. Second, language matters. I think being careful about the terms you choose and also testing those with different groups is important, and not to be sort of missed and understated. I also heard this particularly for Elena. This is an opportunity for your agencies, that there are some things that no one else in the state will own except for you, transfer being one of them. And that's not always a comfortable place to be, but it's it's the reality. And I think that gives you a chance to do some meaningful work that's going to be beneficial for, students in your states. And, because these plans aren't just agency plans, they're state plans. You can be in the driver's seat as conveners to bring folks together and shape what it's going to mean for your states. And I think another thing that Melissa mentioned, this work can be foundational in different ways. I think in Texas it helped set up the work on the community college funding formula, but I think the relationships you build, the language you develop, the partners you bring into this can help be platforms for future work and future goals that you're going to be embarking on. And finally, it's messy. I think that's just the reality of it. And yeah, I would say I've also led some statewide strategic planning efforts myself. Don't beat yourself up when things go sideways. I think that's all part of the process. And I think, hopefully you can lean on not just us, but each other as continue down the roads that you're on with setting state value-centric attainment goals. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Do not hesitate to reach out to each other, to us, or to HCM, with questions, needs, comments, etc. And look forward to continuing to work with all of you. So have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.